welcome to another Sheriff of Sodium video. You know, there's a certain magic that surrounds that three-digit USMLE score. And unless this is your first time listening to me, you know that it is a type of magic that I largely find distasteful, and I've spoken out frequently about our idol worship of the three-digit score and how it's hurting medical education and even residency selection. But the magic persists. And like all good magic, it's in part because there's some sleight of hand involved, because no one really seems sure how exactly that three-digit score is calculated. In fact, for as long as I've been in this space, some of the most frequent inquiries that I get to my website or on Twitter are about how the USMLE score is calculated, or dispelling some myths about how certain questions are weighted more than others or things like that. And so, to be perfectly frank, one of the reasons that I'm making this video today is to dispel some of that mythology. But I'll be honest, my other motivation for making this video is that in showing the basic arithmetic that's done to get from the raw score to the three-digit score, my hope is that we're going to break some of this magic and we can stop this foolish idolatry of the three-digit score and see it for what it is. It's a point-in-time estimate of basic science or clinical scientific knowledge. That's it, nothing more, nothing less. And so, with no further ado, I present to you Breaking the Magic, how the USMLE three-digit score is calculated. Let's get into it. This video is going to have two parts. In part one, I'm going to demonstrate the general method that the USMLE uses to take the number of question items that you answer correctly to get your three-digit scaled score. Along the way, I'm going to explain exactly what the three-digit score is and why we need one. So to do that, first we have to understand why the USMLE uses this three-digit score at all. Why can't the USMLE just give us the raw score? I mean, that's what most of your tests in high school and college did, right? You just took a test and the teacher gave you back the results in terms of the percentage of answers that you got right. Raw scores are very useful in comparing performance between examinees. Say we have two students, student A and student B, and they both take a 20-question test in their Spanish class. And student A answers 16 questions correctly and student B answers 15. And we can tell at a glance when we see the 80% versus 75%, we can tell immediately that student A performed better than student B, and we can tell exactly by how much he did. So why can't we report the USMLE scores that way? See, there's a problem. Using raw scores works great when all students take the exact same form of the test at exactly the same time. But that's not really possible for the USMLE. If every single person took the same form of the USMLE, buddy, I can tell you that everybody's going to have a 300 by the time that the testing cycle is completed. For test security purposes, examinees have to take different forms of the exam. And of course, people are taking the exam at different times all around the world. And so for large scale examinations, you have to use different test forms. And that can create a little bit of a problem. Because suppose that we have these two students, and student A gets 65% of the questions correct, but she took a more difficult form of the exam than student B, who got 75% of the questions correct, but took an easier form of the exam. How do we know which of these students had better performance on that exam? There's a few ways to make that comparison, but probably the easiest way is to calculate the z-score, the standardized score. And what that does is it compares each examinee's performance to the group of people who took that form of the exam. It's pretty easy to calculate too. We can just use the formula here, which basically compares the examinee's performance to the mean performance for the distribution of examinees who took that form of the test, and then it's expressed in units of standard deviation. Assuming that the distribution of all examinees' performance is normally distributed, the nice thing about using these z-scores is that it tells us exactly where an examinee fell on the bell curve. So take, for instance, an examinee who hit right at the mean of the distribution. They would have a z-score of 0. On the other hand, someone who performed 1 standard deviation above, they would fall right here. Someone 2 standard deviations above right here, and so on. So let's go back to our example and see how this may play out. Student A had 65% raw score, but that hard version of the test actually had a mean of 60, so she scored a little bit above the mean, and it had a standard deviation of 5, and so if we calculate the z-score, we'll see that she has a z-score of +1. On the other hand, student B, who scored 75% in the raw score but took an easier form of the test, where the mean performance was 75, she hit right at the mean, and that means her z-score is 0. And so relative to their peers, student A's performance is actually better than student B's, even though the raw score was lower. So this is why the USMLE does not report the raw score. It's because there are different forms of the exam used, and so the scores have to be standardized relative to the group of people who had that same form of the exam. But of course, the USMLE isn't reporting z-scores either, and that's because there's a little problem with z-scores that students don't like. And that's that z-scores can be negative. I mean, if you think it hurts your ego to get a 195 on USMLE Step 1, imagine how it would feel to get a negative score. But of course, half of the z-scores are going to be below the mean and they're going to have a negative number. Take, for example, this student who scored 50% on that hard version of the test. He was 2 standard deviations below the mean, so his z-score is going to be -2. Students don't like getting scores that come out as negative numbers. And so there's an extra step that the USMLE does to the standardized score to give us the 3-digit score that we so cherish and love. And that extra step is to convert the z-score or standardized score to a scaled score, where we do a linear transformation on the z-score to get rid of the negative numbers and make the scale on whatever units that we choose to use. And that's what the USMLE 3-digit score is. It's a scaled score. And you're familiar with these scaled scores, whether you thought about it explicitly or not. This is the kind of scoring that's used for most large-scale standardized tests. So take, for example, the old Stanford Binet IQ test. The z-scores were converted to have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, because you better believe people don't like getting a negative score as the result of their IQ test. Or if you took the SAT when you were in high school, each section may have a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100 because that's the scaled score that they chose. Or if you took the MCAT, the new MCAT that is, each section has a mean that's set at 125 with a standard deviation of 3. Or if you're like me and you took the MCAT back in the old days, there was a different scaled score altogether where the composite score was around 25 and had a standard deviation of 6. We can make a scaled score using any scale that we want with any mean and any standard deviation because all the scaled score is a linear transformation from the z-score. And this is the basic formula that's used. Technically, this is called a t-score. So we set the standard deviation and we set the mean, and that results in the t-score. And folks, this is all that the USMLE 3-digit score is. It's a t-score. So to summarize, this is how we calculate the 3-digit USMLE scaled score. First, we calculate the examinee's raw score. That's easy enough. We take the number of items answered correctly over all test items and multiply by 100%. Second, we transform the raw score into a standardized or z-score, and there we have to compare the examinee's performance to a reference group of examinees who took the same form of the exam. Once we have the z-score, we move on to part 3, where we convert the z-score to a scaled USMLE score, or t-score. And the USMLE has chosen to use a mean of 200 and a standard deviation of 20. And so the bottom line is this is how your USMLE score is calculated. It's just your z-score times 20 plus 200. That's your USMLE score. Of course, what most people want to know is how many questions do I have to answer correctly to get a certain score? Or my score was such and such. How do I know how many questions I got right? Or I have 2 applicants with scores of X and Y. How did their raw performance differ? And using these formulas, we could answer all those questions. It's a simple matter of arithmetic. The trick is we'd have to find some of the data to plug into the formulas, like here and here. And that brings me to part 2, the details. Fair warning, the data points that you would need to fill in the blanks for contemporary USMLE test takers are pretty closely held. I've not seen those published anywhere. But there is one cohort of test takers for whom I can confidently tell you how many questions you had to answer correctly to get the score that you achieved. That cohort is the earliest group of test takers for the USMLE, those who took the test in the early 1990s. But before we get to those details and those calculations, it's important that you understand a little bit about the test's history. Because back before 1991, the National Board of Medical Examiners exams, the forefather of the USMLE, it was graded in a fundamentally different way than the USMLE is today. The NBME exam had a different scaled score for one. It was set to have a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100, kind of like the SAT. But there was a more important difference. The old NBME exam was a norm referenced test. And what that meant was that the pass or fail standard was entirely dependent on where you fell on the bell curve. So to pass part one, the forefather of the step one exam, you had to have a score that fell above 1.2 standard deviations below the mean. You had to be above about the 11th or 12th percentile. And that meant, of course, that around 11 or 12% of test takers every year failed the part one exam. For part two, there was a more lenient standard. As long as you were above the bottom 1 or 2% of examinees, you would pass the exam. The passing standard was set at 2.1 standard deviations below the mean. And as you may start to suspect, there's a real problem that happens when you use a norm referenced test, because it means that a fixed proportion of examinees fail every year, regardless of how well the group did. So for instance, if you have a very high performing class of medical students, imagine that there was a class that was just entirely composed of Sir William Oslers. Well, you're still going to have 11 or 12% of them who are going to fail the part one exam. And you're still going to have 1 or 2% of them that fail the part two exam because you're defining the standard based on just where people fall in the bell curve. And there's always someone who, relative to their peers, is going to be lower. There's a related problem that could occur if you had an entire cohort of test takers that was made up of a bunch of bumbling, incompetent, um, Dr. Nick from The Simpsons kind of test takers, where as the group's performance declines, you still are going to pass on 89% of the part one test takers, and you're still going to pass on 98% of the part two test takers, even if each year performance declines farther and farther. And in fact, this is exactly what was happening in the 1980s. In the 1980s in the United States, medicine as a career was declining in popularity, and admission standards began to erode somewhat, and performance on the NBME exam, as you can see from this graphic from Academic Medicine in 1991, was beginning to decline. And since each examinee's cohort was compared to the previous reference group, you could have a situation where you're passing people on that wouldn't have been passed through in previous years. And it showed very clearly how this idea of using a norm referenced standard was the wrong thing to do. It was obvious that the system needed to be overhauled. And so in the early 1990s, that's exactly what happened. The old NBME Part 1 and Part 2 exams were transitioned into something called the comprehensive NBME Part 1 and Part 2 exams. And the difference was more than a name. There was a different scaled score. Instead of the old 500 with a mean of or a standard deviation of 100, there was now a mean of 200 and a standard deviation of 20, the same scale that we use today. But more importantly, the comprehensive NBME exam was a criterion reference test. And what that meant is that using something called the modified Angoff procedure, they got a bunch of experts together and decided upon what is the canon of knowledge that a borderline incompetent examinee would still know. And they set the pass-fail standard there. And of course, it was the comprehensive NBME Part 1 and Part 2 exams that became the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 exams from 1992 and onward. That's a good thing because it means that in theory, every single person who takes the test could pass it as long as everyone's performance exceeds this objective standard. On the other hand, if you had a cohort of totally incompetent examinees, every single one of them could fail the exam. Now, you may wonder why I'm telling you all this history. And it's because this transition from the old norm referenced NBME Part 1 and Part 2 exams to the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 exams generated a rich literature that ends up filling in the numbers that we need to know to do these calculations here. The first thing that we have to define is the reference group. What I mean by the reference group is the group of examinees whose performance, your performance on the test, is going to be compared to when calculating your z-score. That's where we get the sample mean and sample standard deviation from is the reference group. These days, because the USMLE is offered continuously, it's pretty easy to define and capture a reference group. That's why you have to wait a few weeks for your scores. It's not because the computer takes 3 or 4 weeks for it to calculate how many questions you got right. It's because they're waiting for 800 or 1,000 people to take the same form of the test that you took so that their performance can all be lumped together and you can figure out where you fit on the bell curve, or they can figure that out for you. But back in the day, the exams were only offered twice a year. And so for the first USMLE exam, the reference group was the group of students who took the NBME Comprehensive Part 1 exam the year before. Here's a snippet from the 1992 NBME annual report that clarifies that that is the reference group for the first Step 1 exam. And that's good to know because the NBME examiner in 1991 published the performance in absolute terms on that exam for that group of examinees. The mean percentage of items that was answered correctly was 67.4%, and the pass-fail standard was set at about 57.4%. So now we only need one more piece of information in order to do all the back calculations that I had on the previous slide, and that's the standard deviation, which was not published, but we can still estimate with a high degree of confidence what it is. We can do that because we know that a 3-digit score of 176 was required to pass Step 1, and the scale has a mean of 200 and a standard deviation of 20. So if we go down to a score of 176, we know that we're 1.25 standard deviation units below the mean. That would give us a z-score of minus 1.25. And actually, the performance of examinees almost hit that perfectly. 88.6% of the reference group passed the exam, which would be almost exactly at a z-score of minus 1.25. And now, of course, because we know the z-score and we know mu, it's a simple matter of arithmetic to calculate sigma. So let's do that here. We know that a z-score of minus 1.25 is the passing standard. We similarly know that an examinee who hit the passing standard exactly answered 57.4% of questions correctly, and the exam mean was 67.4%. And so if we solve for the standard deviation, if we solve for sigma, we'll see that it's about 8 percentage points. Now that we know the numbers, it's easy to make something like this. What I did here is I put together a raw to scaled score conversion for 1992 examinees. And again, we can do this with a high degree of confidence because we know the raw score that is required to be at the mean, and we know the data point that's required to hit the minimum passing score of 176. And that allows us to calculate the standard deviation, and that allows us to fit in all the other values on here. So if you took USMLE Step 1 back in 1992, you scored one standard deviation above the mean. You had a scaled score of 220, and that meant that you got 75% of your test questions correct. If you wanted to be 2 standard deviations above the mean, then you answered 83% correct, and so on. It should be obvious, if it wasn't already, that the relationship between the raw score and the USMLE scaled score is a linear relationship. All the math that we did was standard arithmetic. And this should dispel one of the notions that I frequently hear, which is that certain USMLE questions are weighted more than others. That is inaccurate. Every question is weighted the same. Some are specifically chosen to have greater discrimination, but they are all weighted exactly the same. So if you took the USMLE in the early 1990s and you want to know what percentage of items you answered correctly to earn the score that you got back on your score report, you can simply look at this linear function here and calculate it with great precision. We can do the same thing for USMLE Step 2, the exam that we know and love today as USMLE Step 2 CK. All we have to do is go back to the literature to find data to plug into those equations to get from the raw score to the scaled score or back. So from this paper in Academic Medicine in 1992, we know that for the reference group of examinees taking the comprehensive NBME exam, the mean performance was 68% of items correct. The pass-fail standard was set at 57%. And similarly, we know that the 3-digit score of 167 was used to become standard, and the standard deviation was 20. And so if we determine how many standard deviation units down that would be, it would be around 1.65 down. A z-score of minus 1.65 would correspond to this point of 57% of items correct. And we can use that to estimate the standard deviation just as we did before a few slides ago, because we now know z and mu for a given point at this 1.65 z-score. And that would give us a standard deviation of about 6.7%. So a slightly narrower bell curve for the initial performance on USMLE Step 2. And we can then construct the same bell curve because the scaled score is centered at 200, where 68% of questions were answered correctly. The minimum passing score was 167 and corresponded to an exam score of 57% of items correct. So you can see that someone who really had a high Step 2 score back in the day, 2 standard deviations above the mean, answered 81% of items correctly. We can also construct the same linear function of the relationship between the percent of items correct and the Step 2 CK score. We can even go one step further, because with some algebraic rearrangement of the equations that I showed you to get from the raw score to the scaled score, we can figure out the exact relationship between someone's percentage of items correct and their Step 1 score. And if we do that, we can see that this is the linear equation that gives us that result, and that means that a 1% change in the number of items that you answered correctly results in an increase of around 0.4 points on the USMLE. If we do the same thing for Step 2 CK, we can see that a 1% increase on this early form of the exam gave us a 0.3 point increase in your score. These formulas will not work with such precision these days. And it's not because the math is wrong. It's because there's been a shift in the format of Step 1 and Step 2 and a shift in exam performance. Here is a representation of what I like to call USMLE score creep. Bear in mind that back when the USMLE exam was first started, it was set to have a mean of 200. You can see what a score of 200 gets you today. It puts you on the very edge of the bell curve, very close to a failing score. Step 2 CK scores have gone up even more. Look how far the blue bars have shifted from a mean of 200. Examinees today score a lot better than those in the past. The dramatic effects of score creep are easily appreciated when you look at how the percentiles have shifted over time. Like I mentioned, back in the early days of the USMLE, if you had a score of 200 on Step 1, you were right at the mean. Perfectly respectable score. But if you had a 233, you were in the 95th percentile, and you were about to be the king of the world. The world was going to be your oyster. These days, you get a 233, you're barely above the mean. And like I said, for Step 2, the rise has been even more dramatic. From the mean of 200, we now have a mean for US test takers who are taking the test for the first time. We now have a mean of 244. The 99th percentile is now above 270. The increasing performance that drives score creep, as well as the distortion of the bell curve and some changes to the USMLE question number and format over the years, probably changes the arithmetic that I went through on the previous slides. And in an upcoming episode, I'll probably go through how I think these numbers differ in this day and age. But for now, that's all I've got. Thank you for listening.